Today's topic is EMV, an overview with some U.S. considerations. We are going to cover three main topics today. First, and about half of our time will be spent on what is EMV and chip. This is by no means a detailed technical overview. It'll be a high-level discussion of what EMV is, where it came from, and we'll finish up with a bit of a discussion about where EMV is in the world and around the globe. Then we'll spend about a bit of time on some discussions about EMV in the United States, how it might move into the States, what kind of factors are pushing it that the U.S. might want to consider. And then lastly, we'll finish up with some thoughts about what EMV means to me, and I come at this from 2 points of view, whether I'm an acquirer or an issuer of card transactions. So, starting off with EMV, what is a smart card? Starting off very simple. In general, it's obviously a small...
Dave Allen from PNC in Louisville. Can you hear me?
We can, Alan. Can you mute your phone, please?
Well, the attendee list shows that I'm the only one on. If that's the case, you guys don't need to spend all this time for me.
You're not the only one on. We can only see the individual.
Okay.
You can only see yourself. Don't worry. There's 60 or 70 people on this webinar.
Then go for it, guys.
Okay. So, smart card, the analogy I often use for people is it's just like a small mini computer on your card. Think of running a Windows Office suite. You can run multiple applications. You can have Excel and Word both running. Just like your PC, it has you have multiple choices for operating systems, and some of them are listed there. From the high end, like the Multos operating system, down to native operating systems that come from your card bureaus. Just like your PC, your chip card has RAM, random access memory for applications to use. It has ROM that is burned in when it's manufactured and cannot be changed, and so on. And each of those applications have individual memory, so they can be walled off from each other. Couple of key points. Smart cards may have originally had a very specific form factor, no longer. There can be mini cards. The functionality that comes with a smart chip can be in phones, can be in key fobs. Many other form factors are possible, not just the standard credit card we're all aware of. So where did EMV come from? EMV is an interoperability definition for chip card payments, and there's two key words out of that phrase. The first I'll start with is payments. EMV is a set of standards around payment applications, debit card and credit card payment applications. You'll often hear people talk about an EMV chip, which is actually a bit of a misnomer because the chip is an operating system and a processing platform. EMV is specific to the payments that go on. It's like saying I have an Excel computer, right? Excel is just an application running on the computer. The second key word there is interoperability. The main goal of EMV was to ensure that the chip card applications, the payment applications that are running, work internationally, work from any issuer to any acquirer. EMV means that a Visa card issued by Bank of America can get stuck into a Wells Fargo ATM and it works. It means an EMV debit card issued by Royal Bank of Canada can go into a point-of-sale device in the south of France, and it works. It's about a common set of standards and definitions and processes that ensure interoperability between issuers, acquirers, and the payment networks that link them. And that's crucial. What complicates that sometimes is the fact that some features are mandatory and some are optional, as I point out here, but that's the way it is. EMV was started by Europay, MasterCard, and Visa, going on 17 years ago. The three of them got together and decided that, much as where payments have been successful for years, it's when there are common standards that can be used across the industry. Europay is no longer in existence as it was bought by MasterCard, but along the years, several other of the major card players have joined in. It's interesting to note that local and individual card schemes don't necessarily have to sign up and join EMVCO. In Canada, for example, Interac didn't join EMV, but adopted the standards fully and put out a local EMV specification just for Canada. Okay, that's about all I'll do for a history lesson. So, more importantly, why do we care about EMV? Why do institutions want to move to EMV? The first, second, and third reasons are all about fraud losses. In the early days of EMV, some people would talk about the soft benefits, the value-added products you get onto a card, but the main reason, and as I said, the second and the third reason, were about reducing fraud losses. It does this through two tools. It addresses counterfeit cards through the use of a card authentication method, and I'll speak to that in a second, to make sure the card is the real card that was issued. And it addresses lost and stolen and issued not received cards through a reliable verification of the customer. That's the card holder. So we make sure that the card is the actual card, and we make sure the person using the card is the actual card holder. I'll come back to those on the very next slide. Those two drive down those specific types of fraud losses. There is some reduction of operational costs when you move to EMV. It's not huge, but there is some. The major piece is through the elimination of your entire customer dispute. When you have eliminated much of the counterfeit and the loss, you're down to, if you so choose, pinned transactions, and the number of disputes that come into your call centers are greatly reduced. There will still be some, but they're greatly reduced. Those that do occur can also be automated because of the nature of how an issuer would ask for verification from a merchant and how the merchant provides that verification. We're not dealing with signatures on country club chips anymore. There's a small savings in shifting some transactions offline. This obviously applies in some geographies more than other. In fully online markets like Canada and the United States, much less offline presence. It's usually only in cases of communication failures where stores might take on underneath a floor limit. But the ability to shift some transactions offline does have a savings on communications and system hardware requirements. The last reason are the ability to add new value to the chip card. I've listed a couple down there, anything from loyalty applications. A very small extension to the EMV standard allows you to use the chip card and a small device as a two-factor authentication for things like web banking. And as we'll discuss a little when the fraud shifts, web banking is one of the channels that comes under attack, and EMV helps you address that. If it's too much of a tool, if it's too unwieldy a tool for everyday online banking, it's absolutely under consideration if you have high net worth customers who might be logging into brokerage accounts who require a higher level of security. And then, of course, there's a whole range of value-added applications. On your chip card, you can drop ticketing applications for local transit, trains, and many nations around the world have used the same card-carrying and EMV application for identity papers and national ID cards. So let's come back to the two areas I spoke about, the CAM and the CVM. If you're going to work with EMV, you're going to hear these terms a lot. You might as well memorize them. So the card supports some cryptographic capability. Depending on the type of card you purchase, it might actually have a cryptocurrency processor on the card, or the regular CPU can just do the number crunching and do some cryptography. So the first one is CAM, Card Authentication Method. As I indicated before, this is what makes sure that the card that's being used in the transaction is the actual card that was issued by the financial institution and has not been counterfeited. There are three major forms of that. There's one called static data authentication, dynamic data authentication, and something called combined data authentication. And we don't have time on this call to go into the cryptography details, but each EMV card is issued with its own set of keys They are specific to the card, not to the portfolio, not to the bin range, but to that one specific card. And through, if you're familiar with MACing in the ATM world, through something similar to a MAC, there's some cryptography that takes place. It can roll in elements of the transaction so that that MAC cannot be skimmed and copied from and replayed from one transaction to the next. And it verifies when the transaction takes place that this is the real card that has not been counterfeited. Now, we know the card is real. We have to make sure the card holder is the actual real card holder, and that's where CVM comes in. CVM actually in EMV is a very nice little feature because based on parameters set by the issuer when he puts the card into the field, you can adjust the type of verification I need to the environment the card is being used in. Anything from an online PIN, which, to give another Canadian example, all ATM transactions must have an online PIN, and the transaction goes online. Oh, sorry, I got that wrong. The PIN is verified offline, but they require a PIN. Some transactions, based on the device, could be signature. You could be a device that does not have a PIN pad. And then you can also set it up as the issuer to have certain transactions need no signature at all. And while that may have seemed odd a few years ago, if you think about today, we've got lots of contactless tap and go, lots of PayWave and PayPass out there. And you also have automated card acceptance environments, such as parking garages, where even with a mag stripe, there is no cardholder verification. And EMV lets you adjust the level of cardholder verification to the acceptance device, and you can also adjust it based on a number of other criteria, including things like a dollar amount. I could set up an EMV card to say below a certain dollar amount, I don't need a signature, I don't need a PIN. Very similar to no signature rules today. So that's the background on EMV. Now let's move into what an EMV transaction looks like. I know this will be a fairly high-level overview, but it gives you a sense. So that's how mag stripes look today. The mag stripe is red, maybe some elementary checking at the terminal. In certain geographies, there might be a floor limit that is assessed whether to go online or not. Of course, in the United States, those two do not take place. Card goes online for authorization, and then transaction's approved. An EMV transaction, as you can see, is far more complicated. Far more steps take place. I'll touch on each of these fairly briefly, and maybe in a future webinar we could address more detail as to the details of an EMV transaction. So we start off the transaction. The chip is inserted into an EMV card reader, and the first thing that happens is, remember, this card can have multiple applications. It might have a credit card, it might have two credit card applications, and it could also have a loyalty, and could also have my web banking two-factor authentication application. So the terminal and the card have a short conversation to decide which is the application we're going to use. And there's some rules on how that takes place. After that, a bunch of data goes back and forth between the two, based on which application and what they're trying to do. Now, the card and the terminal have a discussion to verify the card authentication method, make sure this is the right card. Finally, there are some processing restrictions that can take place. This is a very interesting part of EMV. Based on a wide number of data elements in the transaction, the chip can make a decision how it wants to process this transaction. I'll give you a very quick example. Things like the card will be aware whether it's domestic or international. The card at this point is aware if it's at an ATM for a cash transaction or at a point-of-sale device for a purchase of goods and services. And there's even a flag to let the card know if it's at a POS device but doing a cashback transaction. And the issuer can set to a very fine degree the flags on the card to react differently at these different situations. I could, for example, set up a card that domestically can be used for ATM and goods, but internationally could only be used for ATM transactions. I could set up a card that only works in certain ways based on certain dollar amounts. Now, I'm not a card product manager. Some of those configurations may not make good sense as a card product to put in the market, but it gives you an example of what you can do with an EMV card. Once we've gone past processing restrictions, that is when the chip and the terminal will ask for the cardholder verification, if there is one. And then finally, both the terminal and the card, or if you will, the acquirer and the issuer, get a last kick at the can to decide how they want to decide what's going on. So the terminal itself makes a bit of a risk assessment, the dollar amount of the transaction, what's going on, what type of goods, and will decide how he wants to handle this. Is he going to approve offline? Will he go online? And so on. That decision is communicated to the card, and the card does exactly the same thing. Based on the nature of this transaction, based on whether there's been a PIN or a signature or the domestic or international, the card will similarly make a risk management decision. That could mean approving the transaction offline. It could mean telling the terminal, I want to go online. Even though you, Mr. Acquirer, say you're happy with this transaction offline, my issuer says this is too risky, I want to go online. And then if it does go online, is authorized by the host. An EMV script is the next very interesting part of the whole protocol. The issuer has the capability to send a command back to the card and change it in the field. This is very often done to change things like offline limits, but it can also be used to block a card if it's been reported as stolen. It can also be used to unblock a card. If a card's been blocked in error or as a precaution, you can then go and unblock it as well. It's a very key differentiator between a magstripe card and an EMV card, that the card product you have in the field now is dynamic. It's no longer static. The magstripe isn't the same 3 years after you issued the card. You can change the nature and the behavior of that card while it is in the field. And then finally, the response back to the device and the completion of the transaction. Okay, that was the high-speed version of an EMV transaction. The screen we're looking at could very easily be a 3-hour discussion if you wanted to go into details. So what does it mean when you put out EMV cards? Well, it affects every one of the actors in the entire payment scheme. As you can read, everyone from the consumer who gets a new card and might be afraid of this thing, or how does this work, they're concerned about privacy, to the issuers that need to be able to put out these cards and work through the complex process of how you issue EMV cards. Acquire processors obviously need to supply their merchants with the terminals and update their switch infrastructure to handle it. The merchants will be getting new devices, they might need real estate on their lane counters, and they definitely have both cashier and customer training issues. The schemes and the switches obviously need to be able to upgrade their systems, and the card schemes in particular need to certify all of the issuers and acquirers that want to move EMV cards and devices into the market. It takes a full effort from every player in the scheme, which is why in most regions of the world, the only way this has been done successfully is when they've all got together and cooperated. So speaking of around the world, so this picture is directly off the EMVCO website, and if you pop in once in a while, it gets updated about 2 or 3 times a year. I won't bother reading the percentages, as you can see around the world. Europe, very much through a chip card rollout. Asia, Pacific, even Africa, South America, Mexico, all well and truly through a rollout to EMV cards, with the great gaping exception of the gray bar between Canada and Mexico. The United States is the only country in the entire G20 to not issue EMV cards. Let's discuss EMV card and terminal deployment. So the graph there gives you the growth of EMV cards and terminals from 2003 to 2009. And I could not source up a current graph, but as you see from the bottom, there are now over 1.2 billion EMV cards in circulation around the globe, and almost 19 million terminals there to accept them. There's a substantial amount of smart card issuance. Over 40% of the payment cards in use in the globe today are EMV cards. So, does it work? We did this whole thing to reduce fraud. So let's look at the UK. The UK is one of the largest fully developed payment system economies to move fully to EMV. And as you can see, I'm going to get my pointer up here. As I said, EMV was put in place specifically to address lost, stolen, counterfeit, and to some extent issued not received cards. So that would be these three sections of fraud in the UK, and as you see, those total up to 77% of all the card fraud in the UK in 1999 was coming from those three categories. You leap ahead 10 years, EMV is fully rolled out on a chip and pin basis, and you see that these three together are 31% of all the fraud. What's grown has been card not present fraud. When EMV rolls out into a market, the crooks move to the online channels, e-commerce, they compromise web banking and do account takeovers because they can no longer succeed in the counterfeit and the cards and the stolen. Now you might say, well, if all you did was shift the fraud, why bother? Well, the fact is, from 2001 to 2010, the 10 years over which they rolled out, total UK card fraud dropped by almost a half on a basis point basis. They went from 18 basis points to 9 basis points over 10 years. So it not only addressed the direct types of fraud that EMV is designed to address, it also suppressed fraud overall. Just to give a very quick update on where Canada stands, being the market right next to the United States, that's ruled. All of the bank-owned ATMs in Canada have now been converted to EMV. The gaping hole in Canada right now are the white label ABMs. Very few have been converted, and the associations are working on how to make them speed up a little. And we're about 2/3 of the way through the POS device rollout. Most of the cards were about there as well. 2/3 to 3/4 of the cards are EMV, and the liability shift has taken place on credit, so that now the weak link in the chain is liable for card fraud. If the merchant has a magstripe terminal and an EMV card is used at that terminal and has to be swiped because of it, the merchant is liable for the fraud. By the end of 2012, all ATMs must be up. By the end of 2015, all POS devices will be up. So a lot of people ask, so is it working? Yes, it is. Debit card and credit card fraud in Canada has easily leveled off, and it's to the point that a lot of the issuers now whitelist transactions that are a chip card at a chip device. So a chipped debit card, an EMV debit card, at an ATM that has been EMV enabled, the issuers will ignore that transaction knowing that it's not been counterfeited. And by getting those transactions out of their fraud systems, it's like eliminating the noise, and they can focus in on the fraud that is taking place on other transactions. So at this point, actually, we'd like to ask a question of our attendees. We're going to hit you a couple of times with the polling question, only 3 times over the whole seminar. Now that you've got a bit of a background on EMV, not sure if people out there have their own intentions, but could you indicate whether your organization is planning on converting any of your debit card or credit portfolios or a portion of your portfolio to EMV, and in what kind of time frame would you be looking to do that? And after a minute or so, or a few moments, our event producer will tell me that we've got our responses in, and I'll move ahead. Okay. So that was our background on EMV. I would like to now move into the section where we talk about how EMV may or may not move into the United States. Oh, and there are the results. So you might see on the right of your screen the results of the poll. Moving on to EMV. So why has not the U.S. adopted EMV? That's a very complicated question. There are many wiser people than me who've been debating this at smart card conferences for a couple of years. But the fact is there's many interrelated reasons. Some of them up there in front of you. I won't read every single one of them. Frankly, the associations have not pushed the move to EMV yet. In most regions of the world, the move to EMV has only occurred when there's been a driving force behind it of either the government or the associations who've come together and put on hard and fast liability dates. And while I'm not privy to the inner circles of MasterCard and Visa USA, to date there's been no sign of that occurring. In the U.S., frankly, the card issuers have done a very capable job of suppressing card fraud. Card fraud is high, but it is better on a BPS basis than many regions of the world before they went to EMV. And they just simply aren't feeling the pain to pay for what admittedly will be an expensive EMV rollout. And that being the next bullet. Conversion to EMV means every ATM in the United States, every point of sale device in the United States, all need to be upgraded. And that's costly. And then on top of that, you need to upgrade all the switches. The cards themselves are a cost much larger than MagStripe, so there is a significant cost to moving ahead with EMV. I've always been kind of puzzled at the next reason, and I've heard people say this at conferences and the like, where they say that they're waiting for a better technology or a more modern technology because EMV is old and out of date. They say that, of course, while they're using a 40 or 50-year-old technology in the case of MagStripe. EMV, the initial specs may be 16 years old, but it has been updated and refreshed constantly. The latest major revision of EMV included contactless payments, and even the NFC mobile payment pilots that we're hearing so much about are based on the EMV standard. And just to add some more confusing market events, very hot topic, considering the announcements of the last week or so, are the effect on issuers from the Durbin Amendment with the restrictions on interchange. So while with the recent announcement the interchange rates are a little higher than we might have initially feared, the fact is that there are still restrictions on how high an issuer can go. You do have some ability to up your interchange rates based on fraud prevention expenses, and I think EMV would qualify in that respect. Contactless itself has had an interesting effect in the United States. The U.S. very quickly drove to contactless with PayPass and PayWave, but it's caused a bit of a confusion, if you will, that people think EMV isn't contactless, that EMV must be chip and PIN. People are confused about where they might want to go. Well, if I want to go straight to mobile, as the next bullet comes in, people think they want to skip EMV and go to NFC. Well, even if you're issuing an NFC credential to a phone, those credentials still need to be managed and issued just the way that you issue a chip card or an EMV application on a chip card. And if I would, I'd always remind people that even with a mobile NFC payment, you still need some kind of customer verification. You might tap and go your phone for a $2 cup of coffee. I don't think you're walking out of Best Buy with a $2,000 home theater system based on waving your phone over a contactless reader. The last issue that's really confused the market for the past couple of years is PCI. Merchants, merchant acquirers, and even issuers have spent enormous amounts of money to become and remain PCI compliant. And it's not just a one-time spend, it's an ongoing annual spend to maintain your compliance and maintain your audit. Because of the cost of PCI, there's been many other alternatives proposed, but in the end, this has led to confusion on the behalf of a merchant. If a merchant is up for renewing or refreshing their POS terminal base, they frankly aren't sure where to spend their dollars. Do they go somewhere on PCI schemes, tokenization? Do they look for an EMV scheme? Really, the merchants at the moment don't know where to turn. However, even with this confusion, things are beginning to happen in the United States. Anecdotally, there are many indications, anecdotal stories of travelers being declined. Either they're showing up at with a magstripe device at a terminal that only accepts chip. They're running into cashiers that have been trained to look for chip and PIN and are just declining or refusing to accept a magstripe. And you also will end up in some areas in Europe in offline devices that just won't accept a magstripe. Not quite as much of a customer problem, but inbound tourists are facing the same problems in reverse. They're used to seeing chip and PIN transactions, and they're not comfortable with their cards being used in what they might perceive as a lower security manner with just a swipe and a signature. The crooks that made so much money off counterfeit in other EMV regions didn't retire. Visa and MasterCard use a phrase called fraud migration, and that's the crooks going to where they can still make money. And as we'll see in a little bit, they're coming to areas that are still non-EMV. Even in the last 6 months, a number of U.S. issuers have announced moves to put EMV into some of their portfolios. For some of these, like Wells and JP Morgan Chase, this was specifically aimed at their high net worth business international travelers, specifically to address the international acceptance issue. For some, like the State Employees Credit Union of North Carolina and the United Nations Federal Credit Union, they actually have announced plans to convert their entire debit card portfolio. So there is movement afoot. Eventually, something will have to break in this puzzle. If you read the text in front of you, what's notable about this quotation is who it came from. This was not an analyst. This is not some commentary, some bystander in the payments industry. This quotation came from a member of the executive board of the European Central Bank, who are now seriously considering whether to remove the mag stripe from their cards completely. That is, gives an indication of the size and the magnitude of the fraud problem. Another alternative path that might take place, because they might be reluctant to take mag stripes off of their cards for their outgoing tourists, would be an interregional liability shift. That Visa and MasterCard Europe could put a liability shift onto Visa and MasterCard US, forcing the costs of the fraud back to the acquirers. There'd be a lot of politics involved in such a move. It wouldn't be easy, but it's indicative of the thinking of some of the EMV regions of the world and where they might have to go. And to illustrate that, let me pull up some statistics for a second. So and I'm having trouble with builds, so I hope this works. Oh, okay. I'm going to have to put them all up. Oh, there we are. So the chart in front of you shows the losses on cards issued from the UK over the 10 years leading up to and after the implementation of EMV in the UK. The UK actually issued chip cards earlier than that 2005-2006 line. They were chip and signature, and then slowly converted them over to chip and PIN on February the 14th, 2006. Chip and signature is no longer accepted. And they had a slogan which I loved called "I Heart My PIN Day." What's very interesting about this slide is you look at these two numbers, the counterfeit fraud losses in the UK as you go over that chip and PIN divide. And it's odd to think, well, the whole reason we did this was fraud reductions. So how come it didn't fall? And even more importantly, look a year later. When you get to 2006, 2007, card fraud in the UK went up by £46 million. And yet the whole idea of this fraud scheme was to eliminate counterfeit losses. Well, the answer, for those if you quickly look down to the bottom, was international use of those cards. This is a fraudster skimming an EMV chip card, either in the UK or somewhere where a UK cardholder is on vacation, and counterfeiting it as a mag stripe and taking it to a mag stripe location and using the card. If you look there, in 2006 and 2007, fraud abroad, that is, a skimmed card being used elsewhere, went up by £90 million. So in fact, when you compare it back to the UK number here, what looked like an increase of 46 is actually a decrease of £44 million in counterfeit fraud, because the fraud here went all overseas. And they've got to go somewhere, and it's always nice to be their destination of choice. The United States is absolutely the destination of choice for these UK counterfeited cards over the 4 years leading up to the final chip and pin. What's very interesting about this diagram is not so much that it shows the USA importing criminals to do fraud on UK credit cards. It shows the change over time from other countries as they implemented their chip devices. Canada, for example, runs number 3 and number 2 in where UK credit card counterfeits were used. But as you see, from 2008 to 2009, dropped from £11.6 million to £6.3 million. That is because this is just when Canada was in the middle of our EMV rollout, and the likelihood of this counterfeit card hitting a chip device increased. So the counterfeit card is a mag stripe. If it gets used at a mag stripe device, the issuer has no choice but to treat it as a regular transaction. When it gets used at a chip device, the issuer sees that it came from a mag stripe, that it came from a chip device but was used as a mag stripe, and they know that something's funny. They say, that's my card, that should have been a chip-on-chip transaction, and I can decline it. So, theoretically speaking, what could move chip in the United States? Well, I'm afraid I've set up a number of straw men here and knock every one of them down. As we've talked about, there's no real signs of the associations trying anything. Will hordes of international travelers go banging on the front doors of their banks saying they want chip cards? No, I don't think that's going to happen. Just as unlikely would be foreign pressure. You know, if a bunch of UK and French banks get together and complain that their cardholders are uncomfortable coming to the States, is that going to happen? Don't think so. Merchant pressure. Initially, I would have said the first point, not likely. They're not going to go beating on the banks either to issue EMV cards because of inbound travelers, but there is a growing swell of merchant opposition to their PCI compliance costs, and this could be a reason why merchants eventually rise up and protest against the banks to do something about growing PCI costs. As we spoke earlier, fraud losses, I don't think will do it, just because the U.S. has done a tremendous job through the implementation of things like real-time fraud. The U.S. fraud has been suppressed very well, and frankly, they could probably improve further. And I don't think in today's current political environment you're going to see much in the way of regulatory mandates. Now, I do want to caveat this page and the next one by saying these are my personal opinions, not the opinions of my employer. So, how will it go into the States? Again, let me emphasize this is my opinion. I'm not a sightseer, but I think this is how EMV might roll into the U.S. And that is just like every other technology has rolled into the United States. The product managers out there or anyone who's taken a business marketing course will recognize this diagram. The early adopters, the innovators, who, these are the people that line up for 4 days outside the Apple store to get the next phone, followed by people who, watch those early adopters and jump in, followed by the early majority. And for EMV, we're still really up here in the United States. There are institutions that for some reason, their own particular market niche, they see an opportunity, they want to steal a competitive advantage. For some reason, they see the need to jump ahead of the rest of the market. And these will eventually be followed by the next people. It will only be when you get a large number of going, they've laid down the path, they've beaten the path for those to follow, that I think you will see EMV roll. And what is it that we'll look for? Well, slowly, one by one, devices are being replaced. ATMs get replaced on a little longer life cycle. Point-of-sale devices generally get replaced on about a 4-year, maybe a 5-year life cycle. So devices going into the field, if they're not EMV enabled, are often field upgradable to EMV. So you don't need to replace the entire device. Some of those early innovators are beating down the implementation costs for those that will follow. They're making software vendors upgrade their software to support EMV, both switch software, in-house software for transaction processing, and even device software from ATM and point-of-sale device vendors. And then what is an interesting one is competitive pressure. I can tell you that in Canada, the competitive pressure between merchant acquirers was very real. And the salesmen for the various merchant acquirers were hitting on merchants, promising them they could get them to EMV faster or bring them some kind of benefit faster because they could get them to EMV 6 months before the other guy. And it became a competitive threat and forced all of them to EMV much faster. So that's the end of our discussion about the EMV in the United States. So if you could answer the next question. So what is your opinion or plans around ATM and point-of-sale devices? Are you currently enabling them today? Are you planning a conversion? And if so, how far in the future will that be taking place? Or you have no plans to convert whatsoever at this point in time? So I'll give you a moment to fill out that polling question, please.
Can't remember.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that survey has been closed. So now following up with our final section and then leaving a few minutes at the end for some questions, what does EMV mean to me as an issuer or an acquirer? Well, if I am an EMV acquirer, in general, my changes will fall in 3 areas. Obviously, I have device enhancements. My point-of-sale devices or ATMs need to be upgraded. You can do this, as I said a minute ago, in 2 steps. You can put in point-of-sale devices that are EMV capable or upgradable, and then later on have a rep come and upgrade the device. Sometimes just a software upgrade to bring them up to EMV fully. EMV devices, acceptance devices, need to have keys injected as part of the EMV security scheme, and that's a whole discussion about key management and cryptography that we don't have time for today. Obviously, you have to update all your transaction processing systems. They have to handle the additional data elements. They have to handle the EMV Issuer scripts that get passed down. As an acquirer, you do have a bit of an advantage that you don't care about a lot of the key management and the cryptography that's part of EMV. That's all between the card and the issuer. The transaction certificate is an electronic version of a receipt. This is how you prove that a transaction actually took place. This is the EMV version of a signed receipt, and you'll need to be able to store those and have some system to be able to submit them to the issuers in the case of disputes. And then finally, you've got customer service training. You need to train your merchants, you need to train the consumers, and as I said, disputes will change a little. Changes are a little more complicated on the issuer side. So obviously, back office, the process of issuing a smart card is a little more complicated than getting a mag stripe out the door. You have multiple applications on the card. Each of those applications can be configured differently, as I described earlier. And your card product managers will go wild in how they set up and define card products for different market segments of the consumer base. Once those cards are in the field, as I also indicated earlier, you can change them. You can change their behavior. You can change their limits. and so on. And all those things need to be managed over the life cycle of the card. There is software out there that can help you do that, but that's part of the enhancements to your back office systems. You will change to some extent your fraud monitoring and how you manage PINs and how you manage risk. Like the acquirers, you need to upgrade your authorization systems, but on the issuer side, you've got a little more to do because you have to worry about the authorization of that card, the authentication of the data elements and the cryptograms. There's a little more on the cryptography and security side for an issuer, as well as managing and deciding on EMV scripting. So those are the commands to change a card in the field, and from your fraud group to actually block the card. Through an EMV script, you can actually turn an EMV card off in the field. And there's some complexities around PIN changes because, again, depending how you set up the card, you may have a PIN stored in the card as well as at the host. And those need both be maintained, and they both need to be kept in sync. And then the forgotten area of an issuer changes is the customer service side. Obviously, there's the dispute management changes, but people need to remember that now more people, the card payment product is now a little more complex. So a cardholder might walk into a branch and just say, my card's not working, and they have no idea if it's a chip problem, what kind of application is on that chip, is it a PIN setting, and customer service representatives, whether the branch, the call center, need to have both the training to deal with that card problem and the access to information about the card. So they need to get at some of your card management systems to understand how to diagnose and fix that customer's problem. Looking forward, you have all these areas that I've touched on, from getting ready to issue the card to managing those applications to controlling it afterwards. These are all the case today as we've evolved from MAG to chip to contactless. And you have to remember that as we move into NFC and mobile, you're going to have exactly the same kind of tools. And your card management and your data preparation to issue these payment credentials needs to be forward-looking enough that you do this once and you do it once properly, and not redo this again as you move into mobile payments. So I'm sitting here in the middle of July. How do I get started doing this? First thing to realize is that EMV planning is complicated. All business planning to some extent is, especially in the technology side of banking, but EMV is really an area where the technology people and the business people need to discuss and iterate how they move through this. The business people need to ask questions about what's feasible, how much will this cost, do you have any suggestions on how I might do this? Explain their business problem to the IT people. The IT people need to work with the business people. Well, this is how much this costs, but maybe here's a different way of doing this. Now that I know what your business objective is, did you know that I could do it this other way that's cheaper? Or did you know there's an EMV option that if I do this, I turn this feature on, it lets you do this business activity? The EMV spec, as I said right off the top, is wide and varied, and there are many optional components to it. And business and technology really need to iterate to understand what the two parties can do for each other. How do I get started? Well, start with things like today. Get some EMV training. There's lots of industry events. There's lots and lots of information about EMV online. I highly recommend starting at the EMVCO website. For the tech heads among you, you can go right down to specifications. For those who already can get to sleep at night, I recommend lots of the business documentation on EMV. It's a very good place to start. But as I just said, make sure you include both your business people and your IT people in this training. It is a joint effort, and it requires both of them to succeed. Obviously, I recommend you speak to your vendors, ACI to start off with. Speak to your card manufacturer, your processor. See what their readiness is. At the bottom left, don't just assess your own readiness. What's the status of my devices, my ATMs, my systems, my software? Go to my processor. If I outsource my host processing, my switch processing, my ATM processing, if I outsource my card issuance, what is the status of all those parties to help me get to EMV cards, even if only in a pilot? One word of advice I would say, start simple. EMV is a complicated spec, and it lets you grow over time. Start with a single portfolio, start with something relatively simple that you can issue, but the key is to put in infrastructure that will grow with you and is flexible. So put in infrastructure that lets you start with something simple and then grow with you so you don't need to rip out one piece of infrastructure and put in another. If you've gone to an outsourcer, be careful of lock-in. If you're locked in with that outsourcer and can't pull stuff back in-house. If you're putting in tools, make sure those tools grow with you as you go down the EMV path. And then a final gotcha to think of, who owns this project at your institution? Is this a card product initiative? Is it a fraud reduction initiative owned by your risk management group? Is it operations that drives this? Is it an IT project? Is it driven by your ATM channel people? All right. At some of the Canadian institutions, this itself delayed some of the projects while they figured out, who drove this bus. And the most successful ones eventually put in a SWAT team approach with representatives from each of the business sections I just spoke to. ACI has lots of ways to help you. Webinars like today, we'll be doing another webinar later this summer that talks about some of the solutions that can help you address your EMV problem. After this event, we'll be distributing a white paper on EMV migration I highly recommend. ACI can help with a number of consulting engagements, anything from providing more detailed training on EMV to working with some of your planning documents. ACI also supplies a number of products to help you in this area. Our payment engines obviously are already EMV enabled. They're in production dozens and dozens of places around the world running EMV. Our Token Manager product helps you issue smart cards and get them out the door and manage them. Our fraud products are already EMV enabled to help you use the initial information you know about EMV. Our card issuing products help you EMV, and our testing tools are already EMV enabled as well. So, as we come to the end of our hour, we'll have time for a few questions, but first I'd like to know if you give us some feedback. Let us know if this hour was informative. Let us know if there was some value in the information we gave to you today. And I think while that window is still up, we'll carry on. During the presentation, you were able to submit questions through the through the WebEx chat window. If you haven't yet, by all means, type them in now and see if you have any questions. As you answer the final polling question, we'll pause just for a second to let those questions come in. Okay, we have our first question submitted. There's obviously a retailer somewhere out there. So the question was, what does the effect that an EMV transaction have on the time the customer is in my payment lane? Actually, it's a very good question because back in the early days of EMV, this was one of the chief worries. The EMV, when the whole scheme was first being dreamed up, in order to support offline payments, the issuers knew they had the ability to get this command down to the card to turn it off, whereas merchants who wanted EMV payments were concerned about things just like a time in the lane, but the only way they were going to get offline payments, which also helps speed time in the lane, was to give the issuers some ability to do this. So the short answer to your question is the effect is negligible. So there's actually two parts to that question. The first is an EMV payment faster or slower than payments today? And chip and PIN transactions are, just as fast as swiping a mag stripe with a PIN entry. They're generally faster than signature because you're not handing as much stuff back and forth, including the receipts. So generally, an EMV transaction is as fast or marginally faster. If a script does come down, if a command does come down, it's a field in the existing message. It's not like another request-response pair, and the time really is negligible. An EMV script, although it sounds like a big command, is actually about 12 or 16 bytes of data and gets played to the card very quickly. So not really an issue if you're a retailer in the lane. Okay, we've got a question about chip operating systems, so I'm actually going to pass it over to my presentation partner, Sam Boutros. Sam has got a ton of deeper technical detail on EMV.
As far as chip operating system, it really depends on the business requirements. But overall, Maltos, which was originally developed by Mondex, has much more security, but is also more costly to implement and to get licensed, and has better post-issuance flexibility. Post-issuance being the ability to add applications to the card or take applications off the card. Java is cheaper, but it also supports post-issuance, so overall very similar functionality. And as far as native operating systems developed by the card or chip manufacturers, they're the cheapest and they're also implemented. Overall, globally, we've seen Java has the highest percentage of implementation around the world.
Thank you, Sam. And we're just over our 3 o'clock limit, but because we started late, I'd like to take at least one more. So the next one is a kind of generic but a very interesting question. Over what time period will U.S. migration to EMV take place? That's one we'd really need a crystal ball for, but I can comment on a couple of the factors. First off, obviously the major factor is when does it start? So, are we starting it in 2011? Are we starting in 2013? It really depends on the impetus. If it's a mandate, if Visa, MasterCard, American Express, U.S. all pass liability shift dates and the like, it'll obviously go much faster. Even with liability shifts and mandates, in most regions, from the issuance of the mandate to the full rollout of cards is generally about a 6 or a 7 year process. The first couple of years of that are all hidden from the market. It's system development and device rollout. It takes 2 or 3 years to get that done, and then generally issuers reissue cards over the expiry life cycle. So it takes them 2 or 3 years to roll out cards. In Canada, I have to go back and check the exact dates, but I think we're in that 6 to 7 year time frame. I think liability shift was announced in 2004.
Yeah, 04, 05 time frame.
Right, 04, 05, which puts us right around that 6 or 7 years from start to finish. If there's no mandate, if there's nothing regulatory from the government or from the schemes, then it could be a long piecemeal process as issuers and acquirers go on their own. And I would hazard a guess there'd be some devices that just never change until a liability shift forces them to. Okay, and we'll go for one last question. We had our last one was I have to admit we're not quite sure what the question is asking. Someone asked about AKB keys and do you require them to work with EMV? So I think what we'll do is we will send that as an email back to the participant. We have your contact information. The key structure in EMV isn't quite the same as the ATM master keys, where you have both tally key block and I'm trying to remember the phrase, and variant keys. But we will get an answer back to the individual that asked about AKB. All right. So I would like to thank everybody for their time. Thank you for participating. Thank you for your responses to the polling questions. As I did indicate, you'll be getting I think you'll be getting an email shortly after the end of the webinar with a link to a white paper that ACI has published on EMV migration in the United States. And that's a wrap. Thank you very much for joining. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.